At 12:42 midnight, the East Garden service gate was unlatched. It should have been sealed and logged. I stood still, listening, noting the damp footprints leading inward, child-sized, careful. The night cameras showed a clean loop beginning 3 minutes earlier. Protocol required immediate lockdown. Instinct suggested delay. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a voice hushed another. I closed my hand on the radio and waited.
The Royal Guard did not move immediately after registering the anomaly. He let the seconds pass, counting the soft hum of the perimeter lights as they cycled, feeling the cold settle through the soles of his boots into the stone beneath. The East Garden service gate stood ajar by a narrow, deliberate margin, enough to allow passage without triggering the older hinge sensor, a detail that suggested familiarity rather than accident. He noted the absence of wind strong enough to shift iron, and the way the latch rested, eased back rather than forced. His gaze followed the maintenance path beyond, where the gravel showed a faint disturbance leading inward toward the palace's secondary corridors. He knelt, touching the surface with gloved fingers, confirming what his eyes had already assessed. The impressions were light, uneven, careful, as if someone had been coached to step where noise would be minimal. He rose slowly, radio still clipped to his shoulder, protocol instructions present, but deliberately deferred. The nightly accountability sweep should have confirmed all junior royals secured in their wings by 23:30, the current time edged toward 1. He accessed the nearby terminal, the screen casting a pale glow across his face, and pulled the access log for the gate. The Royal Guard did not move immediately after registering the anomaly. He let the seconds pass, counting the soft hum of the perimeter lights as they cycled, feeling the cold settle through the soles of his boots into the stone beneath. The East Garden service gate stood ajar by a narrow, deliberate margin, enough to allow passage without triggering the older hinge sensor, a detail that suggested familiarity rather than accident. He noted the absence of wind strong enough to shift iron, and the way the latch rested, eased back rather than forced. His gaze followed the maintenance path beyond, where the gravel showed a faint disturbance leading inward toward the palace's secondary corridors. He knelt, touching the surface with gloved fingers, confirming what his eyes had already assessed. The impressions were light, uneven, careful, as if someone had been coached to step where noise would be minimal. He rose slowly, radio still clipped to his shoulder, protocol instructions present, but deliberately deferred. The nightly accountability sweep should have confirmed all junior royals secured in their wings by 23:30, the current time edged toward 1. He accessed the nearby terminal, the screen casting a pale glow across his face, and pulled the access log for the gate. The line item was blank where a timestamp should have been, not erased, but bypassed, a gap that required higher clearance than his own. He moved along the corridor that branched from the garden, one reserved for senior staff and infrequent movement, where cameras were older and relied on redundancy rather than constant oversight. The first camera's indicator light was steady, but the feed showed a looped sequence of empty tiles repeating every 30 seconds, a clean splice that avoided static or flicker. He marked the time code in his head and continued, noting the temperature drop as the corridor narrowed and the sound of his steps softened against the runner carpet. He passed a service alcove where a maintenance cart should have been docked and wasn't, and a wall panel that bore a fresh scuff, the kind left by a hurried adjustment. At the junction leading deeper, he paused again, aware that initiating a full lockdown would summon supervisors and flood the corridor with personnel, erasing the quiet trail he was following. He chose instead to observe, documenting mentally, maintaining the fiction of routine patrol while the absence of a small, expected presence pressed at the edges of his attention.
When he reached the internal checkpoint, he keyed his credentials and watched the system respond with a brief delay before granting access, a hesitation that did not belong there. And as he stepped through, he heard a sound carried faintly through the stone, fabric shifting, a breath caught and released, enough to confirm that someone was ahead and that the night was no longer contained. Beyond the checkpoint, the corridor opened into a service spine that connected administrative offices to the older residential wing, a route designed for discretion rather than speed, and the guard adjusted his pace to match it, slow and measured, his presence unannounced. He passed a secondary terminal and initiated a passive diagnostic, watching as the system returned normal statuses that contradicted what he had already seen, a sign that the interference was layered, sanctioned by credentials that outranked his own. The pressure of that realization settled not as fear, but as constraint, narrowing his options. He reached the stairwell leading upward and found the door magnet disengaged, another subtle breach. And on the landing above, the runner carpet bore a faint imprint where someone had paused, weight shifted as if listening for pursuit. He ascended without using the rail, keeping his silhouette low against the wall, noting how the lighting had been reduced to maintenance levels, a change requiring manual adjustment. At the top, he checked the schedule display mounted discreetly near the service lift. It showed no authorized movement in this section after midnight. He did not correct it. He moved instead toward the residential wing access point, where a second camera should have captured any transit, and found its lens obscured by a temporary privacy cover, the kind used during renovations, affixed with professional neatness. He removed it just enough to restore the feed to his wrist display, and saw only darkness, the camera's night mode disabled. He replaced the cover and continued, now certain that the pattern extended beyond a single lapse. His earpiece crackled once with a routine status check from Central, and he responded with the expected affirmation, his voice level, giving nothing away. The corridor curved, bringing him within range of the junior royal wing, and he slowed again, conscious of the need to avoid startling anyone who might be there. At the security desk outside the wing, the duty officer's chair was empty, the console active but unattended, a violation that demanded immediate correction under normal circumstances. The guard glanced at the child status board mounted beside it and saw one indicator missing its green confirmation. He did not touch the console. He listened instead, filtering the ambient sounds until he caught the faintest echo of movement carried through the ventilation shafts, distant and irregular, leading away from the wing rather than into it. He weighed the implications, aware that alerting command would secure the area, but also alert whoever had orchestrated the gaps. He chose to proceed alone, documenting each deviation internally, his route now fixed toward the older sections where access was both restricted and plausible under senior authority. As he stepped past the desk, he felt the resistance begin to form, not as confrontation, but as absence, systems that should have supported him falling quiet, spaces that should have been occupied left empty. And he understood that whatever lay ahead would require him to account for later why he had not acted sooner, a calculation he accepted as he followed the path deeper into the palace. The route drew him away from the residential wing and into the transitional spine where the palace shifted from lived space to ceremonial reserve. The air cooler here, the lighting flatter, designed to preserve rather than comfort. He followed the ventilation echo to a junction marked for restricted access, where a discreet reader waited for credentials that were rarely used after hours. The reader's surface was smudged, not careless, but pressed twice in close succession, suggesting hesitation or instruction followed under watch. He did not scan in. He studied the casing instead, and saw the faint hairline mark where the seal had been lifted and reseated, allowing a temporary bypass that would leave no lasting fault. On the floor beyond, the footprints returned, lighter now, crossing the polished stone toward a service door set flush with the wall. The route drew him away from the residential wing and into the transitional spine where the palace shifted from lived space to ceremonial reserve. The air cooler here, the lighting flatter, designed to preserve rather than comfort. He followed the ventilation echo to a junction marked for restricted access where a discreet reader waited for credentials that were rarely used after hours. The reader's surface was smudged, not careless, but pressed twice in close succession, suggesting hesitation or instruction followed under watch. He did not scan in. He studied the casing instead, and saw the faint hairline mark where the seal had been lifted and reseated, allowing a temporary bypass that would leave no lasting fault. On the floor beyond, the footprints returned, lighter now, crossing the polished stone toward a service door set flush with the wall. He adjusted his breathing to the space, minimizing sound, and placed his boot where previous steps had already dulled the surface. From here, the palace's older wing began. Corridors widened for processions rather than patrols, their scale amplifying silence. He passed a wall niche containing a fire extinguisher that had been moved and replaced slightly off-center, a sign of recent human presence in a place that should have been untouched. His wrist display showed intermittent packet loss from nearby cameras, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to blur motion into suggestion. He marked the pattern and continued, aware that he was moving deeper into an area where authority alone explained access. The path narrowed again near a service lift that served the garden pavilions, and he found the lift parked between floors, its control panel disabled from the inside. He took the stairs, emerging onto a landing where the temperature dropped noticeably, stone walls drawing cold from the night outside. The pavilion corridor lay ahead, its entrance marked by a rope barrier left unhooked at one end. He paused there, listening, and caught a soft sound carried from the far end, not speech, but the careful placement of feet. Protocol dictated he announce himself, secure the area, and request supervisory presence. He did not. He advanced instead, keeping to the shadowed side, where the lighting failed to reach evenly, his senses tuned to the small details that confirmed he was on a route used before, not improvised tonight. The pressure of time increased, not measured in minutes, but in the narrowing margin before discovery would become unavoidable. He reached a junction where a keypad protected the final approach to the pavilion grounds and saw the last sign he needed, a recent access code entry flagged as administrative, time-stamped minutes earlier, a level above his clearance. He did not record it aloud. He felt the weight of the choice settle as he prepared to cross into a space where any intervention would be seen and remembered. He keyed the bypass he carried for emergency maintenance, a tool rarely used and tightly logged, and the keypad accepted it with a muted tone that seemed too loud in the stillness. Beyond, the corridor opened to glass panels overlooking the gardens, moonlight reflecting off trimmed hedges and the pale stone of the pavilion beyond. The path between was lit only by low markers, enough to guide but not reveal, and along it the footprints were clearer, spaced unevenly, as if the smaller walker had adjusted to instructions whispered nearby. He moved parallel to the glass, using reflections to check his position, and noted a second set of impressions now visible, heavier, more confident, their stride consistent with someone accustomed to this ground. The pavilion door ahead was closed, but light leaked faintly from beneath it, warmer than the exterior lamps, indicating interior use. He stopped short of the threshold and listened. Inside, movement shifted. Fabric brushed against wood, and a chair leg scraped once, corrected immediately. He identified no threat in the sounds, only proximity, and that distinction sharpened the conflict rather than easing it. Authority misuse rarely announced itself with force. It relied on normalcy, on the assumption that presence equaled permission. His radio remained silent, central, unaware, or choosing to be. He positioned himself beside the doorframe and checked the manual latch housing, finding it unlocked but engaged, a configuration that allowed quick closure without triggering alarms. He tested it lightly and felt the resistance, then released it, the mechanism settling back with a soft click. From within came a pause, a held breath, then continued motion, as if whoever was inside believed the sound belonged to the building itself. He adjusted his stance to block the approach path and considered the sequence that would follow any action: reports, reviews, quiet corrections. He was aware, with a clarity that did not soften, that the child was somewhere beyond the door, present by design rather than chance. He waited another count, allowing the scene to define itself, and when the door handle turned slightly, not enough to open, he shifted closer, placing his hand on the latch, prepared to close the distance and the space together. The moment stretched, unresolved, as the garden lights cycled and the pavilion remained occupied, and he understood that the next movement would set the terms not only for the night, but for the record that would follow.
He did not announce himself when the handle eased again. He waited until the gap widened enough to confirm the interior, then stepped forward, placing his body between the door and the path, and closed the pavilion gate with a controlled force that carried across the garden without echoing. Iron meeting iron, a finality that cut off retreat rather than invited attention. Inside, the light revealed a small table set with 2 cups and a folded cloth, nothing ceremonial, nothing overt, and beside it the princess stood with her hands clasped, shoulders drawn inward against the cool, her eyes moving first to the gate, then to him, recognition arriving before relief. The adult opposite her wore a tailored coat bearing no insignia, posture relaxed, expression composed in the way of someone accustomed to rooms opening for them. When they turned, their gaze settled on the guard with assessment rather than surprise. The guard did not raise his voice. He shifted one step to his left, aligning himself with the princess's peripheral vision, a subtle repositioning that placed him closer without touching, and spoke only to request that the child return to her wing. The adult replied calmly, citing authorization without producing it, tone measured, the cadence of rank implied rather than declared. The guard listened, eyes on the child's shoes, noting how her toes angled toward him, how her weight shifted back as if rehearsed restraint had begun to fail. He repeated the request, this time adding the time, the deviation from schedule, the absence of escort, facts stated without inflection. The adult's jaw tightened briefly before smoothing, and they stepped half a pace toward the table, as if to reassert the normal order of the space. The guard stepped with them, mirroring distance, maintaining the barrier, and reached behind him to secure the interior latch, a motion that limited the pavilion to those present, without triggering external alarms. The sound of it drew the princess's attention. She flinched, then steadied when he met her gaze and inclined his head, a minimal signal of reassurance. He asked her if she was cold. She nodded once. He removed his outer jacket and draped it over her shoulders without ceremony, the fabric too large, the gesture practical. The adult objected softly, reminding him of protocol and the hour's sensitivity. The guard acknowledged the reminder and did not comply. He shifted again, opening a clear path toward the exit behind him, and waited, aware that the choice now rested not with authority, but with the child's willingness to move. She took one step, then another, stopping only when the adult spoke her name, the sound careful, proprietary. The guard's hand closed around the gate bar, and he met the adult's eyes for the first time, holding them without challenge, and said that the meeting was concluded. the adult exhaled, a controlled release, and reached into an inner pocket, producing a card that bore a seal the guard recognized and clearance he could not contest, placing it on the table rather than offering it, as if to anchor legitimacy to the space. The guard glanced at it and returned his attention to the princess, asking her to come with him now. She hesitated, then crossed the remaining distance, her hand brushing his sleeve, fingers cold through the fabric, and he adjusted his stance to shield her as they turned toward the door. The adult spoke again, this time naming consequences in neutral terms, reviews, questions, the difficulty of misinterpretation, and the guard acknowledged each with a nod, committing them to memory. He opened the gate just enough to pass, then closed it behind them, engaging the latch fully, the sound final in a different way. The garden markers guided them back along the path, the princess walking quickly, the jacket slipping until he steadied it at her shoulders. He did not ask questions. He matched her pace and watched the periphery, noting the return of camera feeds as they crossed invisible thresholds, systems correcting themselves now that the space was no longer occupied. At the pavilion corridor, he keyed a manual lockout, citing maintenance in the log, a temporary measure that would draw inquiry later, but secure the route now. The princess's breathing slowed as they moved, the tightness easing from her posture, though she kept close, eyes down, absorbing the weight of the night. At the service lift, now responsive, he chose the stairs instead, preferring the certainty of movement to the speed of machinery. When they reached the residential wing, the duty officer had returned to the desk, eyes flicking to the jacket, to the time, to the guard's face. No questions were asked. The guard escorted the princess to her door and waited until she stepped inside and the inner bolt engaged, the indicator returning to green on the board. Only then did he remove the jacket from his own shoulders, where it now rested, fold it, and hang it on the peg outside her room, a marker of presence rather than possession. He stood there for a count longer than required, listening to the normal sounds of the wing reassert themselves, and then turned back into the corridor, aware that the quiet had shifted from concealment to anticipation, and that the record of the night would soon demand a different kind of clarity.
By the time the guard reached the operations office, the palace had resumed its regulated stillness, the kind that followed disturbance without acknowledging it. Lights steady, corridors cleared, systems reporting nominal status. He logged his presence at the terminal and requested a private report channel, selecting the format that required narrative sequence rather than summary flags. The room was narrow and functional, insulated against sound, its temperature set low to protect equipment, and he stood rather than taking the chair, grounding himself through posture. He began with the unlatched gate, the missing timestamp, the looped feed, listing each deviation in the order encountered, neither compressing nor embellishing, allowing the accumulation to speak. He noted the unattended desk, the absent indicator, the administrative access at the pavilion keypad, each time-stamped to the minute. When he reached the moment of intervention, he described actions rather than intent. Gate secured, child escorted, route locked pending review. He did not name the adult. He recorded the clearance card as presented without attaching inference, citing its seal and level accurately, attaching a still image from memory capture without commentary. The system prompted for justification of protocol deviation, and he entered the minimum required. Immediate child safety assessment indicated escort to residence. He saved the report and watched as it routed upward, the status changing from draft to received, a quiet acknowledgement that carried weight. Within minutes, a supervisor entered without knocking, expression neutral, eyes moving briefly to the standing posture before returning to the screen. Questions followed, measured and specific, seeking sequence confirmation, distances, timings, the guard answering each without qualifying language. When asked why lockdown was delayed, he replied that observation preserved evidence. The supervisor paused, then accepted the answer without approval or rebuke. A second figure joined them, senior by bearing rather than insignia, requesting to review the log entries directly. The guard provided access and stepped back, hands clasped behind him, listening to the soft taps as records were cross-checked. No one mentioned the princess by name. When the review concluded, the senior figure instructed that the corridor remain restricted pending maintenance and that the pavilion be closed for inspection, orders framed as routine. The guard was advised to remain available. As they left, the supervisor hesitated and reminded him that deviation carried consequence regardless of outcome. The guard acknowledged the reminder and remained standing until the room emptied, then finally sat, the chair cold beneath him, and waited as the palace began its quieter process of correction. The response unfolded without announcement, adjustments appearing incrementally across the system. Access permissions tightened, camera firmware updated, manual locks engaged where digital oversight had proven insufficient. The guard observed these changes from his post later that morning, recognizing the signatures of senior involvement in the precision and speed. He was called once more, this time to confirm details already recorded, the repetition serving less to gather information than to test consistency. He remained consistent. At no point was he asked to retract or revise. By midday, a notice circulated citing temporary restructuring of after-hours movement protocols for junior royals, framed as precautionary, effective immediately. The pavilion was listed as closed indefinitely. The clearance card he had seen did not reappear in any query. In a brief meeting, he was informed that his actions would be reviewed by a standing committee, a standard process, and that he was to continue duties without modification. The phrasing carried neither threat nor assurance. He returned to the East Garden during his next patrol and found the service gate refitted with a new sensor assembly, its latch firm, its status light steady. The footprints were gone, gravel reset, the maintenance cart returned to its alcove. The camera feeds ran live, uninterrupted, their timestamps aligned. He paused there longer than required, cataloging the corrections, aware that resolution in the palace often manifested as absence rather than acknowledgement. In the residential wing, the child status board held all green indicators, and from behind one door came the muted sound of pages turning, a small, ordinary continuity. He did not stop. Later, a note appeared in his personnel file, citing commendation for thorough reporting, paired with a caution regarding independent action outside protocol. The balance was deliberate. He accepted it without comment. As days passed, the night routines resumed their predictable cadence, and the pressure eased into something quieter, a shared understanding that required no language. The guard continued to walk his routes, senses attuned to the small details that signaled change, knowing that instinct had not replaced protocol, but had been recorded alongside it, an entry that could not be erased. When he passed the pavilion grounds weeks later, the lights remained off, the path blocked by temporary fencing labeled for inspection, and he noted the way the palace had chosen to remember the incident, by closing a door and moving on. He adjusted his pace, resumed the patrol, and carried forward the knowledge that protection sometimes concluded not with recognition, but with silence, and that he would be expected to maintain both.